Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming on this cold, cold day. We're very happy to have you here. I'm Susan Levine. I'm the director of the UIC Institute for the Humanities, and we're very excited to have Raj Patel with us today for this lecture. Before we start, I want to give a few thanks to people who've made this possible. The lecture is part of the UIC Chancellor's Initiative in the Humanities. And the theme that we've taken for the last 3 years on that initiative has been food studies at UIC, global and local issues. And I really do want to thank Chancellor Paula Allen Mears for this initiative and for her support for the humanities here at UIC. Other parts of the initiative include, we've got a postdoctoral fellow in food studies in the humanities, which is probably the only one of its kind in the country. We also have a working group, the Chicago Area Food Studies Working Group, as part of the Institute for the Humanities. And we've had a number of really exciting programs through that. So anyone who wants more information about that program can visit our website, the Institute for the Humanities at UIC. I also want to thank the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at UIC, Estrita Tantillo. She also has been a real support for humanities and for our Humanities Institute. And I also want to invite everyone to a reception after this lecture, which is going to be in the room way in the back there. And everyone is definitely invited. So now I would like to introduce my colleague, Gayatri Reddy, who is at the UIC Gender and Women's Studies program and the Department of Anthropology, and she's going to introduce our speaker this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Great. Well, thank you, Sue, and it's my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce Raj Patel this afternoon. Of course, Raj Patel doesn't really need an introduction, especially for this crowd, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce him anyway, if only to remind us of sort of what an unalloyed pleasure it is to have him visit UIC and speak to us or speak with us today. So Raj Patel, as you all know, is an award-winning author, activist, public intellectual, food policy expert. He continuously challenges our presumptions about the global economy and his work, with his work as a policy analyst, academic, and activist for global food justice, food sovereignty, and the values sustaining our society, polity, and economy. He's worked at some of the most influential and hated, I should add, multilateral organizations, even as he has protested against them, written for a range of different audiences, taught at several universities, all the while striving to find ways to improve the world's food system and economic system. Raj Patel is currently a research professor in the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, a visiting professor at the Unit for the Humanities at Rhodes University, South Africa, and an honorary research fellow at the School of Development Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, also in South Africa. He has degrees from the University of Oxford, where he earned a BA in philosophy, politics, and economics, and I think also tried math, which he liked, but he said he was rubbish at. From the London School of Economics, where he got a master's degree in economics, and Cornell University, where he earned a PhD in developmental sociology. He has worked for the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, organizations, as I said, that he's also sharply critiqued. He has been a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley's Center for African Studies, an honorary research fellow at the School of Development Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and he has long been a fellow at the influential Institute for Food and Development Policy, or Food First, as it's perhaps better known. He has testified about the causes of the global food crisis to the US House Financial Services Committee and was an advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, among several other food justice advocacy efforts. He has given talks all over the world, from Berkeley to Brighton, Vancouver to Lima, Austin to upstate New York, and this is just in the last 2 months. Right? And UIC, of course, Chicago. For those of you who are TED Talk fans, Raj Patel has a brilliant talk on food justice that works fabulously in the classroom, and I confess I and my colleague Anna Guevara, who co-taught a food studies course, a course on labor, gender, and food in India, used the talk and Raj Patel's work to brilliant effect there. Recently, just in the spring of this year, Raj Patel co-taught the edible education class at UC Berkeley with Michael Pollan, and this is an initiative that was started in 2011 by Alice Waters of Chez Panisse fame in collaboration with UC Berkeley to bring edible education to the university, and I love that phrase. And of course, Raj was there this spring. So in addition to his dizzying array of public speaking and teaching arrangements, Raj Patel also has numerous scholarly publications in economics, philosophy, politics, and public health journals to his name. He also regularly writes for The Guardian and has contributed to the Financial Times, the LA Times, NY Times, San Francisco Chronicle, the Mail on Sunday, and The Observer. And of course, as most of you know, Raj Patel has also written and published a number of books that speak to issues of global food politics, food sovereignty, food justice, and more recently, the monetary values enjoined by our economic system, or the ways in which the market prizes every aspect of our lives today, and what we can do about that. That is the political roots of the current food, climate, and economic crises. He has co-authored and co-edited a range of books with titles such as Food Rebellions, Forging Food Sovereignty to Solve the Global Crisis in 2009, Promised Land, Competing Visions of Agrarian Reform in 2006, and Can Anyone Hear Us? Voices of the Poor in 2000. His first single-authored book, which many of us in the room know well, was Stuffed and Starved, Markets, Power, and the Hidden Battle for the World Food System, published in 2007, which was truly, to quote Naomi Klein, a gift to a world hungering for justice. It's a brilliant, accessible book that outlines the salient issues plaguing global food politics and what is being done about them globally, and while providing a compelling case for why we should care about food sovereignty and justice. And his latest book, published in 2010, is a New York Times bestseller titled The Value of Nothing: How to Reclaim Market Society and Redefine Democracy. Opening with Oscar Wilde's observation that nowadays, quote, people know the price of everything and the value of nothing, end quote, Raj Patel offers a brilliant analysis of our current value system and how our faith in prizes as a way of valuing the world came to be, and importantly, what we need to do in order to create a more just, equal, and sustainable economy and society. Raj Patel is also currently working on a groundbreaking documentary project about the global food system with award-winning director Steve James. It is titled, if I'm not mistaken, Generation Food: Breaking Rules to Feed the 21st Century, and is scheduled to be released next year in 2015. In short, I don't know how Raj does all the things that he does, but I know I speak for several of you in the audience, am ever so grateful that he does manage to do all these things and write and speak about them. And it's our incredible good fortune that today we get to hear sort of a snippet of that inspired work from Raj himself in a talk provocatively titled, Cook, Eat, Man, Woman, Competing Ideas to Feed the World. Please join me in giving Raj Patel a warm UIC welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much. That's such a generous introduction. I'm clearly, the only way to go from here is down. So let me do that. But I guess what I want to do is just present you with two different ways of that sort of broadly are being offered to us as how it is that we're going to feed the world in the 21st century. And then really the fun part is where we get to talk about it and figure out why some of those ideas are very, very bad. And why some of those ideas may be very good. The first set of ideas was provided by the, I mean, it comes from the United States government under its presidency of the G8. These ideas were launched in 2012. And in 2013, these ideas made another sort of reappearance at this place. This is Bridewell Palace, where the British government, when it was in its moment of the presidency of the group of 8 countries, held a conference in there. And the name of the conference was Fighting Hunger with Science and Business. And it was held, you can see 2 buildings there. On the left is Bridewell Palace, which I'll get to what that is at the moment. But on the right, sort of attached to it, is the Unilever building. That colonnaded structure is the Unilever building. And in fact, the two are connected. They're all now part of the Unilever empire. And the head of Unilever, Jan Polman, starts the conference. And he says, yes, here we are at Bridewell Palace. And as well you know, Bridewell Palace was one of the places where Henry VIII used to make off with his mistresses, and then it became a place where it was just a recreational palace, then it became a brothel, then it became a prison and a debtor's prison, and now it's the Unilever headquarters, signifying, I think he wanted to suggest, a break between what preceded Unilever and then what happened afterwards. But in many ways, it is still a brothel of sorts. And I make this, I mean, I mention that just because what happened next was very interesting. So after Jan Polman says, and here we are to fight hunger with business and science, 2 young people were brought up to the stage. Their names are Frank and Mwajuma. Now, try as I might, and I wrote to the UK government and wrote to a bunch of people to find out what Frank and Mwajuma's second names were. And we were actually never told. It was just Frank and Mwajuma from East Africa. Here they are. And so they come up to the stage. And Frank and Mwajuma said, we are Frank and Mwajuma, and we are both survivors of malnutrition. And we implore you, the governments of the world here assembled, to fight malnutrition because we have lived its horrors. And they had. I mean, they had in ways that were very familiar to people who've studied malnutrition. I mean, these kids grew up with their grandparents. Their parents went off to find work. The grandparents were ill able to provide food in times of need. And so what happened was, there's a party next door, sorry. So what happened was that Frank and Mwajuma came up and they made their sort of entreaties, and then they were ushered off. And who should bound up to the stage but David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And David Cameron said, thank you so much, Frank and Mwajuma, that was very moving. And, it's not just bad, it's not just bad that Frank and Mwajuma go hungry, but it's poor economics. And then he reeled off a series of figures, like the fact that malnutrition will cost the world $3.1 trillion this year, or that micronutrient deficiencies will have a cost of $1.2 trillion. And he made this sort of effortless move between what it is that Frank and Mwajuma had experienced and a world in which the deficits of hunger were given a dollar value. And you may be familiar with these kinds of ideas. The idea that if someone who's malnourished today will lose 20% of their average income compared to someone who isn't malnourished today. These are the kinds of figures we're growing up with, and these are the kinds of figures that are now circulating in a discussion about the war on hunger. But the next step, and I just want you to put a pin in that idea, but the idea that we have these dollar values of of how much it costs or rather what hunger costs the world and why it's bad economics. Because I wanted to go on to the actual policy that was being celebrated here. And the policy is called the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. The New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. And you may wonder, well, what is that? It was articulated by the head of the United States Agency for International Development. And he said, well, look, we need a public-private partnership. I mean, he's channeling the sort of Obama mantra. And he said, look, we're never going to end hunger in Africa without private investment. There are things that only companies can do, like building silos for storage and developing seed and fertilizers. And so he said this when the New Alliance was originally launched in 2012. Now, what's interesting about that statement is that it's factually incorrect. It is utterly wrong. If you think about the original Green Revolution, for example, and some of us were talking about that earlier on today, but the original kind of boost to agricultural productivity that happened in the 1950s and 60s, the silos for storage and the developing of seed and fertilizer, none of that was done by the private sector, absolutely none. So you end up with an interesting question. I mean, these things were done by the government, they were done by the Rockefeller Foundation, they were done by philanthropists, they were done by non-governmental organizations. But the last group that did it was the private sector. The private sector had nothing to do with it. So you've got to wonder, well, so why is he saying that? And I submit to you that the reason he's saying that is not because he's being historically accurate, but because he wants to create a political necessity. He wants to sell us into a world where we cannot imagine doing things without the private sector. And if we believe that, and even if you don't believe that's true, but if you believe that politically there's just no other way to do things than without the private sector, then you get sent on a road of thinking about hunger and how to end hunger that's very different from the past and very different from what is currently existing on the ground in some other areas. And you end up with the idea and the necessity of public-private partnerships, because the government can't do anything and the private sector has to be involved at some level because we can't do things without the private sector. So if that's what you think the New Alliance is, I mean, if that's the political background to it, let me just give you what the New Alliance claims it's going to do. It's going to lift 50 million people from poverty by 2020, and it's going to do that with 3 clear mechanisms. It's going to do it by mobilizing private capital, taking innovation to scale, and managing risk. Now, I mean, this is the last time I'll use PowerPoint like this because it's very dull to do it this way. But I just want to sort of give the New Alliance its due. That really what it wants to do is fight hunger and end hunger by lifting people from poverty, which is reasonable, by the way, because the reason there is hunger in the world is not a shortage of food, but poverty. And so if you're interested in fighting hunger, you must take on poverty. I think that's a very reasonable idea. And of course, the way it wants to do it is not by giving poor people money. Oh no. Instead, what we're going to do is figure out ways in which the wealth of the country in which people live can be added. There's ways to add value, and private capital will do that, and there'll be clever ideas, and they'll be built out in many, many ways, and the risks that the private sector faces in doing that will be managed, and somehow the jobs that will be created thereby will end poverty, and that's how you end hunger. So that is a fair and balanced approach to, a fair and balanced representation of what the New Alliance is going to do by these public-private partnerships. The private sector is going to create jobs, end poverty, and then end hunger. So you've got to think, well, all right, well, so what is that? What does that look like in practice? I mean, we've heard all of this stuff. And one early indication of what this might look like came from a report from the German Marshall Fund. If you look at the title of this report, it says, "The New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, Pushing the Frontier of Enlightened Capitalism." Now, I think that's indicative of something. I mean, I think it's indicative of the fact that maybe capitalism usually isn't enlightened. In the way that, when Bill Gates came out with his book a few years ago, Creative Capitalism, people smirked and said, well, so what's the capitalism that you've been doing up to now, Bill? Because in fact, many people pointed out that Bill Gates has made his money not through creative capitalism, but through rather uncreative monopoly, which is what you get when you monopolize an operating system. Nonetheless, the idea was that what the New Alliance is about is companies going in it not just because they want to make money, but because they want to make people better off. And this was the idea of what the New Alliance is meant to be like. Trouble is that the New Alliance is building off a series of other initiatives that don't look terribly enlightened. What they look like is handouts from various governments to various corporations. So, for example, the New Alliance builds on something called the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Are people familiar with that? Have you heard of the AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa? Basically, the idea is that Kofi Annan, the former head of the United Nations, together with a range of private entities and governments in Africa, said, well, the Green Revolution worked tremendously well in India, and so we want to have some of that over in Africa. Now, we can have a long conversation about whether the Green Revolution worked in India or not, but the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa certainly has done a few things, and it's built infrastructure for the private sector to be able to sell things, and the New Alliance is going to sit on top of that. So one of the things that the New Alliance is doing is, as I say, working with the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And so there was this report that came out a little earlier on this year, or actually no, last year, that pointed out that DFID is the Department for International Development, this is the UK equivalent of USAID. And they pointed out that as a result of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, a supplier to agro-dealers in Malawi was saying that all of Monsanto's sales of seed and herbicides are made through the AGRA-supported agro-dealer network. Now, what that means is that you've set up this fantastic infrastructure in Africa to be able to get farmers their fertilizer and seed, and that infrastructure is not the government. It's not the equivalent of the USDA. No. These are private. These are private contractors who are shifting Monsanto's product, and Monsanto wouldn't have been able to shift it without them. So what you're creating is sort of a private sector infrastructure to get farmers farming, and the public sector has very, very little to do with it. Now, what I want to suggest is that actually, if you really want to see what this New Alliance is about, let's look at the New Alliance document itself. Here's a document from Malawi. And here are the three things that the Malawian government has to do in order to commit itself to the New Alliance, right? This is the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. I just want to re-emphasize, this is about food security and nutrition. So have a guess at what the three things the Malawian government is going to do. The three things are, and I'm going to read this out to you, you can't read it. Number one, improved score on Doing Business Index among the top 100 economies. The second thing is increased dollar value of private sector investment in the agriculture sector and value-added agro-processing. And the number three thing is increased private investment in commercial production, sale of inputs and produce, and value addition. So you may think, well, weren't we talking about food security and nutrition a second ago? How is it that this is, what's the increased doing business, increased score for doing business, doing as a thing that the Malawian government has to do? And a lot of people thought, well, this doesn't sound right. This looks like it's, foreign countries colonizing, sending their businesses to colonize Africa. And there was an NGO called One that tried to fight back against this and said, well, it's not all foreign NGOs. I mean, not all foreign companies are involved in colonizing. There are some African ones too, but no, they point out that this is a slightly older graph, but the bars are about right. The companies that are investing in the New Alliance are spending a lot of money. I mean, the actual number for some of these companies is actually double what is represented here. But have a guess, what company from Norway is going to invest in agriculture in Africa? Norsk Hydro, no, because they're an important energy and hydroelectric generator. But this is one of Norway's largest companies is Yara. Yara is one of the world's largest fertilizer companies, and they have committed now around $3 billion to the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. And Syngenta are there, and then you have a number of other companies. I mean, in the US, as you see, is comparatively little, but you've got your large-scale supermarkets and food companies also doing their bit. What One was encouraging you to look at is that Tanzania bar. to be able to say, no, this isn't just about European and North American countries colonizing Africa again. Instead, this is about Africans also taking charge of things. And that Tanzania graph represented a biofuels investment in Africa, which oddly and sadly turned out to be mainly based, I mean, although it was incorporated in Tanzania, it was all Swedish money. So, but never mind. Point being, there is a reasonable point here, which is to say that, you know, this isn't just about an imperial kind of, you know, foreign companies coming in and colonizing Africa, because African companies are interested in doing this as well. So, for example, if you look in Malawi, there's any number of Malawian companies who are going to do things to increase the investment of the private sector. And I'm just going to run through a couple of these. I mean, you know, you're going to have agro-processing, you're going to increase, update your irrigation, you're going to expand seed production on 50,000 hectares. And of course, you get those 50,000 hectares by dispossessing people and what has come to be known as a land grab in Malawi. So people are being, we heard a story there about a traditional chief who'd been, instead of giving food away, he'd been giving money, and people were like, oh, we'll take the money, but why are we getting money this year instead of food? And it turns out that that money was a payoff for them then to be kicked off their land, so the land could be sold under these auspices to private companies. And of course, you know, and you also have international companies, you know, tobacco, of course, a very big industry in Malawi. 95% of Malawi's foreign exchange comes from tobacco. And so they're going to increase health by selling tobacco. Riddle me that later on. But you know, the bottom line being, it's not just about, you know, this sort of foreign imperium coming into Malawi. The domestic bourgeoisie in Malawi is very happy to accept this money, and they're driving this process. So let's complicate this a little bit and just say, look, we're allowing Malawians to be as corruptible as we're allowing Europeans and North Americans to be corruptible. But we're still very far away from answering this question, which is, look. Maybe there's a food element. I mean, we can see that there's agriculture and you're going to grow mangoes and tobacco and God knows what else. But where's the nutrition coming from? Why are you calling this the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition? And herein lies a very interesting story. So there are two sort of moments here which are interesting in the Malawi story. There are two commitments that the government is encouraged to, but it hasn't mandated, but it is encouraged to do. One commitment that it has undertaken to improve nutrition is iodizing salt. The Malawian government has said that it will try and iodize salt. And again, I mean, this is not a bad idea. Iodizing salt is a good way of getting iodine into a population where you know, you're not able to access that iodine. It's a good thing. Trouble is, of course, you need to have money to be able to buy salt to be able to get your iodine. And if you're strapped in the cash economy, then actually accessing this kind of thing is tough. But never mind. Well, let's forgive that and move on. Because the other connection, or the other commitment that Malawi has promised to do is this. I couldn't find a picture of maternity leave. So this is as close as I could find. But basically, Malawi has agreed to increase the amount of maternity leave from 6 weeks to something else. They haven't really specified what that is, and despite repeated inquiries, no one in the Malawian government knows exactly what it's going to be. But the point is interesting, right? Because what they want to do is address nutrition by encouraging women to breastfeed, and you can do that really only by allowing more time for breastfeeding. And so the idea is that they want to increase the amount of maternity leave. The trouble is, of course, that about 1% of women in Malawi are involved in formal employment where they would get maternity leave. Leaving the vast majority of Malawian women without any of this stuff. But again, what this reflects is that this is kind of a bourgeois project, right? I mean, if you are living in the cities and are able to get maternity leave from your formal employment, that's great. And no one's saying that this is a bad idea. No one's saying either of these things are bad ideas. But it's very interesting that they're circumscribed in the way that they are. And they're circumscribed in the way that they are because of an idea that I'm keen for people to circulate a little bit more. You may have heard of this idea from Michael Pollan's work, but he popularized other people's really sophisticated thinking on it. In particular, the work of a guy called Georgi Skrinis, who wrote a book called Nutritionism. And nutritionism is this idea of a reductive focus on the nutrient composition of food as the means for understanding their healthfulness, as well as by a reductive interpretation of the role of these nutrients in bodily health. So the idea here is that nutritionism is the idea that if you just give people the vitamins, everything's going to be fine. If you add the iodine, or if you add time so that people can breastfeed, everything's going to just be great. And this gets us back to an interesting idea about how it is that, and why it is that we live in a world where we're starting to hear ideas about how much it costs, about how much how much it costs the world to have malnutrition. And some of that work has been done by Aya Hirata Kimura, who is an academic in Hawaii. And in her book, Hidden Hunger, she points to a really interesting moment, a really interesting historical moment that happened in just after the end of the Cold War. So again, here's historically the moment. The World Bank has seen that the Berlin Wall has fallen, and we're living in a world where there's no Soviet Union anymore, and there's no compelling reasons to think about the state as an architect of making change happen. And this is the kind of birth moment of these ideas of public-private partnership. And the World Bank is being tasked with the idea of thinking about, well, how are you going to end hunger? You at the World Bank, what are you going to do? And so what they reach for are these ideas of public-private partnership. And they put forward an interesting publication called Enriching Lives. And in it, they have this idea of deficiencies of vitamin A, iodine, and iron could waste as much as 5% of gross domestic product. But addressing this comprehensively and sustainably would cost less than 0.3% of gross domestic product. Now, first of all, I just want to flag, that's weird. Historically, there's nothing normal about measuring human hunger and its costs and its benefits in terms of gross domestic product. That's the sort of thing that really only starts at the end of the Cold War. And it's only possible to think of it at the end of the Cold War because of the rise of a certain kind of neoliberalism. Right? Historically, people were never talking about hunger as the sort of thing that you could buy your way out of. But this was like a dog whistle. Writing this pricked up the ears of some very interesting organizations, and organizations that were kind of summoned forth by this World Bank report. In particular, an organization called the Business Alliance for Food and Fortification that was headed by Coca-Cola, Danone, and Unilever. Now, what's interesting about this is that all of a sudden these organizations didn't hear malnutrition, it's just a tragedy, and look how easy it would be to fix it. That's not what they heard. What they heard was, this is an opportunity for us to sell our product and to figure out how to move our materials into the global south. And in fact, in a report that they put forward, they said that they were ready to help because companies already owned the right technology to make a difference, as well as the distribution channels and communication networks. And that came in a piece of writing called the Business Alliance for Food and Fortification, and that was published in 2005. Now, what's super interesting here, think about this. This is where business hears the call for the utter waste of Frank and Mwajuma's lives, and instead, instead of seeing the tragedy, what they see is a business opportunity. And so this is the sort of the alternative that we're really being presented with by our governments is, let's team up with the private sector, let's create jobs, let's create opportunities for them to provide nutrition. And if that's the case, then it's very interesting to think about the role that Frank and Mwajuma play. This, by the way, is Frank and Mwajuma. Frank and Mwajuma are being represented here, and they feature in this conference that happened a year ago. But the reason they're there is kind of the food industry's habeas corpus. What you had to do is show the bodies of suffering people, and the food industry would take care of it. The fact that Frank and Mwajuma may have ideas about how to end their hunger really is not relevant. What Frank and Mwajuma think strictly, they could have just been paraded on stage, and they could have remained mute, and people would be like shaking, nodding their heads and saying, yes, there is suffering here. But their voices and their power as citizens, their humanity, matters not at all. That's why why I'm using the term habeas corpus. It's just show the body, and you don't have to do anything else. And instead, what will happen is that their agency is absolutely denatured. They're presented as victims, but they're never presented as people with ideas. Their bodies through which suffering is channeled, and through which the private sector will be able to lift up, if not them, then their children, because the private sector will be able to deal with the issue of nutrition and be able to think about iodizing their salt and providing vitamin A. And in other words, this representation of hunger and malnutrition does is usher us into the era of poverty with added vitamins. That essentially is the kind of world that we're in at the moment, where the private sector doesn't specifically commit to ending poverty through direct means. There's just a vague ambition to lift 50 million people out of poverty by 2020. But instead, in terms of concrete things, we're going to make business easier to do, and we're going to add vitamins in the meantime. That's one alternative, and it's the ascendant alternative in terms of feeding the world in the 21st century. But I want very quickly to point out that in Malawi at the same time, there was a different set of ideas going on, and they were constituted very differently. And so I'm going to use you as representatives of Malawian farmers, because at the end of the 1990s, there were, life expectancy in Malawi, about the size of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 17 million people. Life expectancy was 48 years old. And the rate of child malnutrition was 50%. And some nurses in a pediatric nutrition unit said, look, we need to stop infant and child malnutrition. And we see that the main crop that people are eating in Malawi, do you know what the main crop in Malawi is? The staple crop? Take a guess. Corn, yeah. So the main crop that people are eating in Malawi is corn. And they said, well, look, we need to grow other crops. Unfortunately, there was no government support to be able to do research into farming and figuring out other crops. So basically, there was a small NGO that was started out of this hospital, and they gave farmers seeds. And there were 5,000 farmers whose job it was to experiment. And so they took seeds. They created a kind of peer-to-peer farming network, and they figured out how to intercrop. They used ideas from America, so ideas like the three sisters. Familiar with the corn, corn, beans, and squash. You plant the corn because you like the corn. You plant beans because beans are nutritious, but they also fix nitrogen in the soil. And you plant squash to help cover out the weeds, and because squash is awesome. This polyculture is something that they experimented with and adapted to their local situation. And what was interesting about this was that they were able to grow as much corn and increase the amount of protein by 40%. So and they did it without government support. They did it basically through his NGO, giving seeds and creating these peer-to-peer networks of research and of learning. And so it wasn't, the private sector coming along with its ideas, or Monsanto, whoever it was. It was, in fact, ideas generated from the farming community as peers. So I'm going to use you as a farming community. So imagine you are Malawian farmers, and you have an interesting problem. And the problem is this. You've got this amazing farming system. You are now growing food that is, you're growing as much corn and way more protein, and it's super nutritious. But child malnutrition remains high, and in some cases maybe going up. So why? You've got all this food, and child malnutrition is going up. Why is that? Shout it out. The food has no nutrition in it. No, well, actually, what's interesting about corn by itself is kind of a nutritional wasteland. And even if after you treat it and you figure out ways of getting the vitamins out of it, it's still fairly crappy. But what you have is way better than that. It's actually super nutritious. You've got some incredible things there. You've got cowpea. You've got a range of legumes. You've got a diversity of crops you never had before. And not only that, but you figured out a range of other things. You figured out how to put leguminous trees in the fields to be able to fix nitrogen and provide shade so that your crops are climate change proof. You figured all of this out already. You're doing great in terms of nutrition, in terms of making your fields climate ready. It's awesome. But still you have this problem. You have lots of food in the field, and child malnutrition remains high. Why? Price is too high. No, because this is your stuff. You're not buying it. It's there, and it's yours. It's ready for your consumption. So why you're selling it? So no, because this is your stuff. It's there. You can eat that, and you should eat that, and you're going to eat that. But why else is it? You've got all this stuff in the field. It's great food, and child malnutrition is up. There's more children. Actually, no. I mean, the fertility is kind of remains the same through this time. So it's not that there's more children going malnourished. Children don't like the food. I mean, to some extent, these are novel crops. But no, I mean, if you go to a Malawian garden, you'll find that people are ready to experiment and eat all kinds of things. I mean, you've got aubergines, you've got chilies, you've got tomatoes, you've got New World crops, you've got Asian crops. So that's not really it. I'm going to wring this out of you. One more. Come on, take a guess. Distribution. Well, no, but it's because actually, it's there, and there's no one sort of sucking the food out of the system. The reason is, yes, sir. Not too much, but there's no process. I mean, there is processed food in the cities, but this is the field, and so we're not having Coke coming out of the ground. So instead, so the answer is this: harvesting is women's work. Harvesting is women's work, but so is cooking and fetching firewood and carrying water and breastfeeding. And so when the amount of harvesting goes up, because you've got more food to harvest, and it's a polyculture, it's a much more sophisticated system, so the amount of time you spend harvesting is going up, but you still have to carry water, and you still have to fetch firewood, and you still have to cook, then the amount of time for breastfeeding can go down. And when the amount of time for breastfeeding goes down, infant malnutrition goes up. So how do you fix that? Have the men do what? Harvesting. Have the men get in your dreams, sir. Women want to maintain control of the harvest because the harvest is capital, and it has the makings of capital. The minute that they're often worried that men will take the harvest and sell it to the lowest bidder and use the money for drink. I mean, I'm not saying that all men do that, and it's not true that all men do that, but some men do, and there's a concern. So women want to maintain control of the harvest because they can maintain control of the household budget. So instead, they do something else. What do? Use machines? No, because unfortunately, there's just not enough money to be able to do that. Plus, there is no machine for agroecology, really. I mean, this is not something that can be engineered because it's so sophisticated to grow crops like this that you can't really. There is no machine that would do it. They dole out formula. No, this is what I imagine the nice people from the New Alliance would like to do. But the answer is, of course, they get men to cook. Imagine, you need to constitute yourselves as a farmer research group, people, because this is exactly what they did. They all right, how are we going to get men to cook? Any ideas? Give them alcohol. Yeah, in your dreams again. Any ideas about how to get men to cook? Go on strike. Yes, the Greek tragedy way. Well, actually, what they did was they kind of did what the Food Network does. Like, are you familiar with the Food Network? So they went round with like a celebrity, basically a local chef and a nutritionist, and they went door to door, and they go into the household and they say, "Hey, man of the house, come over here." You may have seen this before. You may have seen your wife hunched over this. This is a pot. And the man would be like, "Oh, I've always wondered how that worked." And so you put it down, and then you have a day where you make lovely recipes and you use the pot, and the man's like, "Oh, and wait, I can stir it like this," and it's and yes, you can. It's fantastic. And then of course everyone goes away, and there's this like, "Bye-bye, you've changed my life, bye." And of course nothing changes, because just like the Food Network, that was a day of entertainment rather than a day of social change. So in the end, what they came up with was something called recipe days. And now these recipe days emerged through this peer-to-peer farmer network. No individual person claims to have come up with this idea. But what they are sort of social moments of great equality, where women and men get together and they cook, and it becomes partly a competition. So you gamify this, right? To use the Silicon Valley language, you turn this into a contest, and there are about 100 people there, women and men, and everyone is equal. So it's not a carnival where, you know, women dress up as men and men dress up as women. This isn't about an inversion of roles. Instead, it's sort of like a prefigurative community. It's a community of radical equality where you can learn about a range of things. I mean, you know, they emerge because of this, you know, the farmer-to-farmer networks from crop diversification. But they use these peer-to-peer networks to share ideas. And one of the interesting things about these recipe days is that they figure out new ways of cooking food that kids like. And I'm going to show you a clip in which you can see various people coming up with engineering new ways of cooking these new foods so that people will eat them and love them. And, you know, just like here, just like in the United States, folk in Malawi want their kids to eat nutritious food, and kids are resistant. And so figuring out new ways of doing that is a challenge. And generating that knowledge is awesome. And so what they're doing is you know, not only sharing ideas about what grows well in the field, but also how to cook it. But also it becomes a space where women get to call out men on our shit. And it also becomes an interesting place where mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law can have some fractious conversations. I mean, in every culture, the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship is fraught. And in Malawi, no less. And one of the interesting things that this space becomes is a space where, because both people are equal, you know, the younger women can sort of say, I respect many of the things that you say, but this idea about weaning my child at 2 months old and giving her porridge, that's a bad idea. And that's unfortunately, that's nutritional information that's passed down from mothers-in-law to daughters-in-law. And it's something that gets challenged. And it's very rare to find a space where you can challenge these kinds of ideas, and yet recipe days become that. And they, as I say, they become also a space to confront patriarchy and share new feeding practices. And what I want to do is show you how it works. Because you have this recipe day, and then you have follow-up. You have like feminist organizing. So you have this day of joy, of pleasure, of sharing, and then you have the sort of day-to-day ground campaign of transformation. And you need both of them to work together. And the clip that I'm about to show you is, again, filmed by Steve James. Steve James, man, Chicago's living legend. You know, he did Hoop Dreams. He did The Interrupters. He's just got a fantastic film out about Roger Ebert called Life Itself, and it's such an honor to be able to show a small clip from this forthcoming film, Generation Food, where you'll be able to see some of what recipe days are up to.
Tanguika soda na tushuga pachoko waka na mafuta tangu chako pachoko na tumchere taikako soda taikako vile ambayo tukuika pa moto
pasa tutapa vapsha ngoti kutora mafuta tukuika pa moto pase fria na kuika pa moto
tindanjire mibungwe chifukwa nkuwerezera bungwe chifukwa ndikukwala ngiye kufumira mikoka yitu tikakhalanga mukusuzikira vose vinthu kagwiranga ndini kwakuyana na kuti kuphika kupenja dembe kwali kulima uku kucherera kukaya inatengeranya na kubeka inachereranga ndini mlechi kwako kuti tatolako mma 2000 kweni nyengo yonse yakumanyuma vanga vakuti para ine nina nthumbo nyake mwana wali kumusana tacherera tose kumunda ndikuti pati kufuma kumunda tikwenda iwo vanyanira kwenda waka kuchopa kambaka pano nditi pala tafika pano panyumba mbwene akukhala waka pampando apo chete kweni kwasono namutikanjira mvubwe vakatisamiza vajenda kuti mwanalume angagwira ntchito zachanakazi.
mbuto iyi ni za sono niyilamukapuka kwa imwe cha
Kweni icho chikumbire nzauti nge mungalimbikiranga nanga uli kabva choko udongo lingasintha nyimbo ineyocha
watibona kuti mwanyitu tukukwezi zili monani kweni kuno kuti ndikutanga takhalira
kuno mwakhalira nani ndiponso apo vikusuzga chomene kuno mwanyitu mwanalume chigaya chinu chitu chakubamba munguvipulikisika makonacho vajenda ngenkanira tikayangapo daziro bala mulamu mushari kukaika
isi tingakwanise nati mwesanga watereka nkhari
wechikwa chakusuza yaya mulamu chikwa chakusuza yaya mungachepe chambala
so vanyani vafika titamcheza mwesanga kuti ninafukaza mbwenini ndeni mbwene bwe icho chujipikira mwakazi walipara nani
ya ivangaseta yaya mulamu kutola mukuona mulamu oro mu bible viri kulembeka kuti nikupangirenge moviti uyu wakalenga adamu chiuta akalenga adamu nakuyoya kuti wakasanga kuti munthu lawana phukwa uchitachita wakukhalakhala kuti nikupangirepo moviri munthu wakuti wakuovirengeza mwanakazi dangu lake ni isi tivaovirira ine nani
so kuti mulekelana nchakusuza lekanine mbani kunika kwaniwa kuti nti mwana wafuma kuti ndikukapa kwenkhanana tikasipana ukapa ana nivikile njani soziko iyi iwo kuinga kakumola mwakazi nawo towa panyumba kweni mbwe ngasanga kuti ipo nikhale nilele vana wangu kulekela wanyaku vana vangakwanisika cha soziko ipapakale inenga niko mvakani iwo ndio vashia wao ndio kwa kambula kuziana nini mvakani
In fact, the end of the story there is that Winston, unlike all the other men, in fact, who've been part of this project, or unlike the vast majority of them, Winston doesn't see the light, in part because he has another wife. He, in the end, Jennifer decides effectively to just go it alone without him, and she ends up being able to take care of her kids and be able to help other women in the village who are struggling in circumstances that are even worse than hers. And they spread these ideas of agroecology and of farming differently and of different food practices. And the bottom line, and I suppose I should give you the punchline here, the punchline is that it works. The recipe days, I know this graph isn't terribly clear, but basically the outcome is that after having done these interventions, child malnutrition in the village has gone down dramatically. And together with recipe days, together with a range of other things that people have mobilized for as a result of being part of this political community. So they've mobilized for better healthcare, they've mobilized for better access to everything from a seed bank to local capital, local investment funds to be able to invest in their future agricultural production. They've done a range of things that have emerged through this political process of organizing, and the result is that the pediatric malnutrition unit in the hospital has closed for want of cases. So they've managed to shut down the malnutrition unit because these recipe days, together with some other things, have made such a dramatic difference. And I think that points to what's different about this other way of feeding the world. and I think that this might be a good place just to end on and then maybe take questions. What's systematically different here is the agency that, and the respect for knowledge and the respect for the capacity of human beings to be able to invent and reinvent and to become important in this story. I mean, again, think of Frank and Majuma. Their ideas matter not at all. Think of Jennifer and Anita and Winston. Their ideas are everything. Their capacity for action is everything. Their ability to engage and to be scientists and to be in the science and business that fights hunger. The science and business that fights hunger in this story is that comes from the village itself. And yes, of course, there's a role for research, and yes, there's a role for science, and yes, there's a role for data, and yes, there's a role for understanding how much it is that things cost. But the terms on which those questions are asked and set and answered are not set by the demands of business. They're not set by the demands of governments. They are asked and answered by the community itself, and that looks a lot like food sovereignty. It looks a lot like communities taking democratic control of the food system and ending hunger. And it seems to me that there's a lot that we in the United States can learn from that. I mean, not just in terms of confronting patriarchy, which, although its death, reports of its death have certainly been greatly exaggerated in the United States. Patriarchy is alive and well here. And recognizing that and figuring out ways to fight it are important. And the idea of spaces, of these sort of prefigurative communities, these communities that show what it's like to live in a world where there is equality, that is something that benefits everyone. And that's something that we can certainly learn from. So is the idea of this peer-to-peer network of learning. Rather than concentrating expertise in the hands of just a few people, this isn't a science-free process. In fact, it's a much more scientifically intensive process. And agronomists belong in this story, and soil scientists belong in this story, and agricultural economists belong in this story, but they don't belong as the architects, they belong as the co-builders. And that's a very different way in which you fit into a network of knowledge and of understanding. And similarly, I mean, it seems to me that if we have spaces to be able to do this, then actually we get to upend the role of business. So this isn't a story without absent entrepreneurship. There's lots of entrepreneurship. There's lots of exchange. There's lots of people starting their own businesses. There's something called climate change stoves that the women in the village have developed. They call them climate change stoves because it's because of climate change. It's harder to find fuel wood, and so these stoves burn far less firewood than an open fire does. And so they make these tiny stoves, and they cook just as well as an open fire, but they're way more efficient. So they're called climate change stoves, and they're made by these women and sold in the marketplace. So this isn't a story about we must become autarkic and not engage in commerce or business or science. But on the other hand, it's quite the opposite. We need more science and we need more business. And what fighting hunger with business and science suggests when it comes to the New Alliance is the opposite. What you're doing is concentrating expertise, reducing the number of people who can be scientists, and in fact just constraining yourself to the kinds of outcome where in 20 years they would be lucky to have this kind of reduction in child malnutrition under the New Alliance. And yet this has been achieved in the course of, in one case in the course of 7 years. So it seems to me that we're confronted with a choice. I mean, a choice between allowing neoliberalism to have its wicked way, and in fact, the choice to allow people to make mistakes. Again, there's nothing perfect about this story. The outcome with Jennifer and Winston is imperfect. The idea of initially going the Food Network route, that was a mistake. It just didn't work. But it didn't work, and then the community learned from it. It's like that. There's a lovely Wendell Berry exhortation, which is to be like a fox, make many tracks, some in the wrong direction, practice resurrection. And by working on, by being able to learn from these mistakes, the community owned it and learned and made it better, and they iterated. And of course, there's no iteration in the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. There's just one shot, and it's already been thought out, thanks. So it's going to be dropped on the ground, and if it works, then 20 years from now, we'll have another program, and which will likely not learn from the mistakes of the past. So again, it seems to me that we are faced with these, with different ways of thinking, not only about outcomes, but also about where power lies. And that, of course, is the idea of food sovereignty. And I think those are the ideas that are going to be able to feed the world in the 21st century far more effectively than the command and control policies that failed in the past and will undoubtedly fail again. With that, I want to thank you and throw it open to questions. So thanks very much.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, thank you very much. So I am a first-year PhD student here at UIC, and my interest is actually in these ideas of food sovereignty and agroecology. So what are some research, more narrowly defined research topics or areas I can look at that would push these movements like food sovereignty, these ideas like agroecology in the midst of agribusiness and neoliberalism still being the drivers of our economy and the way people get fed?
Well, it depends not just who you ask, but where and when. In this story of recipe days, if you'd have come in when they were just grappling the question of how do we get men to cook, then your research might have been about the failure of a door-to-door cooking scheme. But if you'd have come the year after, you'd have started to look at how it is that a door-to-door cooking scheme had failed, and that people were now working on a new scheme of something called a recipe day. And you would have witnessed the first awkward steps made by some of the men at the first recipe day, and we've got some photos of them. It's really very interesting to look at the way in which some of the men are, engaging in cooking and pounding pounding the soybeans, and you would have heard the stories of men who had an intervention staged around them. Like when Winston was saying, "Well, what if my friends see me cooking?" That's a real thing. That's a real concern. I mean, some men have staged an intervention for their buddies, and they see one of their friends cooking, and they'll physically lift him away and throw the pot down, and take him to a place of greater safety, usually a pub, because they're convinced that he's been bewitched. Or if you'd have come a year afterwards, you'd have started to see that actually more and more men were on the side of the cooking rather than on the side of the intervention. So it depends on who you ask and where and when you do that. But I love it that you're asking this question, because really what you're surfacing is a question that every academic worth a damn is asking themselves, which is, how do I put my privilege in the service of people who need it? And how is it that as people lucky enough to be exploited by this academy, that we also figure out a way not only of fighting back against that exploitation, but also using the tremendous privilege of education and the good fortune to be doing almost always what we love, in service of people who have not been given that opportunity, and to whom we need to make ourselves accountable. And those are questions that will never go away, and I wrestle with them still, and that's as it should be, because there's no magic answer to this. There's no, fill out this consent form and everything will be fine. The consent form is the last possible thing that you have to worry about when you're doing your research and thinking about the problems that you address. But I think finding your constituency is part of your research, and that may seem like an easy way for me to say I'm not going to tell you. But in fact, it's the hard part of doing good research, is finding who it is that you have to serve. And that you discover through your passion and through your interests and through luck. I think most academics here who've gone through the research process will know the invaluable process of the invaluable contribution of luck in finding a research topic in a community to do that with. But you can make your own luck by exposing yourself as often as possible to new experiences and new places and new ideas. But I think that you don't have to travel. You wouldn't have to travel very far from Chicago, it seems to me, to find the community that needs your smarts and your compassion and your commitment. Thank you.
Hi. So I think it was really interesting how the conversation on the children's health was then related to gender equity in this community. Mm-hmm. And my question, the the woman, Anita, I believe, was she a leader previously? And then how did it change the dynamics of women within the community as a whole? And then I guess my question is, the men were even resistant to assist even though they knew that it would result in their children being healthier? And how is it that the women reconciled that, like trying to keep their families together, keep their husbands, and then keep their children healthy?
Those are great questions, and in the movie we'll get to touch on a little bit more of that. But let me give you some of Anita's history, and I'm doing this because she wants it known. In fact, you know, we went through a very long process of asking Anita, look, are you sure you want to tell us all of this, and you want to tell us on camera, and you want us to share this with the world? And she's like, no, I want people to know. So her story is very, very interesting. She always wanted to be a nun. Anita wanted to be a nun because she was the second daughter of a second wife, and you know, her experience of family and of marriage was one of constant struggle. So her ambitions were to actually be you know, families and marriage was just not going to be for her. The only husband for her was Jesus, and so she was going to, you know, she went to a theological school, and she was doing very well. And the nun said, yeah, that's great. So Anita, you are going to be sent to the cloister. The rest of your life will be spent in a nunnery. And Anita said, no. The reason I wanted to be a nun was because you know, there were these nuns in the community, and they were the only people who ever gave me any love. I wanted to be with them. And the nun said, no, not for you. No, you are definitely a cloister nun. You're not a community nun, no. And so Anita said, well, you know, so she went home, and then she was invited to a wedding. And at the wedding, she caught the eye of a village headman, Christopher, her husband. And then he arranged to have her abducted, and she was abducted and beaten. And one of the abductors was Winston, who you saw there. And the traditional knowledge there is that once that happens, you don't go home, because if you go home, one of your parents will die. And so she ended up marrying Christopher, and she was very unhappy. And she then you know, she had kids. She had one kid, and then very soon afterwards she had another kid. And she went to the local hospital, and she met there a woman who is also pivotal in the story. We haven't seen her yet, but she was one of the women who started this project. And she saw in Anita a leader. I mean, she saw in Anita someone who was able to go out into the community and make change. But there wasn't a project through which she could do that. But so in the end, the nurse practitioner and Anita did figure out that what they needed to do was get Anita some contraception. And since her husband wouldn't approve, she was injected with intravenous contraception in secret for a while. But Anita had the strength to do that, and the strength to be able to just make these decisions for herself. And as time went on with Esther, the nurse practitioner, and then with a friend and colleague, Rachel Besner-Kerr, who is now a professor at Cornell, but who's been working in this community for a long time, they together started this project, and it was natural that Anita then became a leader through that. But you're right. I mean, you know, so Anita's story has been one of constant fighting and resistance, and she is an incredible person. She kicks ass, and everyone who ever meets her sees that. In fact, the reason we followed her story was because you know, when Steve James was out in the village, you know, and we saw 100 villagers, and he just panned his camera over it, and he was like, that woman there, and she wasn't even talking to us, she was talking to her friends, but the way that she held herself and the way that she was able to offer commentary and hold a crowd was just incredible. So she's always been a leader, but you're right. I mean, you know, isn't there something weird about the fact that you're telling men, look, your kids are going to live longer if you just do this, why aren't you doing it? Well, part of it is that if you go individually and lecture someone, all you're going to do is guilt them, and guilting people into something doesn't seem to work very well. Even though you're like, yes, of course I should, you know, for the kids, you know, but that doesn't work. But what's interesting about a recipe day is that it's also about pleasure, and it's also about experiencing something in a way that you've never experienced it before. And that's what they discovered worked well. So it's not just about going door to door making men feel important about how wonderful it is that they are learning to cook. But in fact, to have this experience of equality together. And that's something that, interestingly, that in the world of psychotherapy is also being discovered, that actually group therapy often works better than individual therapy for some things. Because individually, you reinforce some of the tropes that you're actually trying to make disappear. And in this group setting, they discovered it's pleasurable, it's joyful to actually seed some patriarchy. And so, and that's a strange feeling, and that's why it's sort of interesting to have group work as a way of sort of working through that. But so this is something that they've discovered by trial and error from time after time. But these cultural norms are pretty tough. As I say, I mean, the interventions that buddies stage for one another are a real thing, and it's only by creating the pleasurable experience of something better and something beyond that, without patriarchy, where the powerful give up their power. And experience doing that in a way that doesn't cripple their identity, but actually augments it. Creating those kinds of spaces is hard work, but it happens, and you just saw it happen right there. Thank you.
Hi there. I was curious to ask, after the creation of recipe days, years later, did you see a shift in maybe harvesting trends, like I had maybe suggested earlier, how men would take more responsibility since there's more like gender equality happening, and then maybe even a reduction in like violence, like domestic violence?
That's a great question. We are in the process of doing a survey. We have anecdotal evidence from a small N, like from a survey of 47 people, 42, I think, said that there was more equality in the household, that household welfare was up, and that people felt happier in the marriage. What we've certainly seen is, in the final version of this, we will undoubtedly end with a picture of of Anita and her husband Christopher, the guy who arranged for her abduction, carrying water together. I mean, Christopher's a very interesting guy. I mean, for all the screwed up things he's done to his wife. But I mean, by the end of it, she has, brought him and made him her equal. And so there's this lovely scene at the end where they're carrying water together. And that scene, by the way, was something that we didn't stage, and we didn't know was happening. We came early one day, earlier than we said we would, and we had the camera out, and we just saw them emerge from the fields holding this bucket of water together. And it's kind of funny because they look like Laurel and Hardy. She's quite big and tall, and he's very small and thin because he was malnourished as a kid as well. And they're holding this bucket of water together, and it's a really tender, really beautiful moment of equality in the fields. But in terms of harvesting, women's control over the household budget is still an important thing. And in fact, it would be better, study after study suggests that women's control over that, it works much better than an equal control over that. But what we're doing now is in a large survey, trying to find out the answers to some of these questions. People reporting in a survey that domestic violence has gone down, or that women, are being listened to by their husbands. That's as close as we can get in a small N survey. We can ask that question again and again with larger and larger numbers. What people say on surveys and what happens in real life, it might not necessarily correspond. But as best we know, there seems to be a trend that actually there is a reduction in domestic violence. There is a reduction in inequality, and the kids are doing better because we can measure that, and and we've seen the height for weight scores going way up, and now we're seeing reports of a range of other benefits, including increased household income and welfare, and that's not a bad outcome either. But we're doing a big survey at the moment to make sure that these aren't statistically kind of weird. Other questions? Be bold. Yes.
Thanks very much. I feel like there's some kind of an optimism at the end of your talk, and but I have a question. What allows you to stay so optimistic? Because on the one hand, we've got this agency that's transformative from the community, from the grounds up, but then we have this other agency from the capital kind of pushing on that, and so I feel like you're more optimistic than maybe the reality may kind of allow us to be, because these people are working against, as you started talking, right? The capital is pushing very strongly against them, and it's the government interference that also kind of does a lot of work.
Yeah.
So where do you stand on that? I mean, what allows you to continue kind of believing that one side has more kind of power behind?
Oh, no. I mean, it's interesting. I had wondered whether to begin with the recipe days and then end with Bridewell Palace and the brothel. It seems to me better to end on an up note, just out of kindness to the audience, because this isn't a Werner Herzog film. I mean, we're not making people depressed at the end. But you're right. I mean, there is a tension between pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. It would be irresponsible of me not to talk about just how powerful Unilever is. And in Malawi, I mean, I suppose there's a virtue in everything. I mean, the prime minister the president, Joyce Banda, who signed up to this, has now been deposed because of corruption and scandal within her government. And the upshot of that is that the New Alliance is moving much more slowly in Malawi than people on the New Alliance side had hoped, and that makes me quite pleased. I mean, this isn't to say that it's crumbling, and that the New Alliance is in abeyance. On the contrary, I think that these companies are very powerful. Right. But I guess when I think about the global reach of these powerful corporations, it's been very interesting to see it erode recently. I mean, Brazil just enacted a ban on all advertising to children. That's something that's being rolled out there. They have dietary guidelines that encourage people not to believe corporations. It's official government policy to disbelieve everything that agricultural corporations advertise on TV. It seems to me that 10, 15 years ago that wouldn't have been possible. So already, to the extent that we have these little sort of blips of hope that are magnified. I mean, it's not just an individual village doing this. So many villages are involved in this. But it's at a level where you're seeing some of these corporations being pushed back. I think that's reason for optimism, optimism of the will. But I think I'm with you. I mean, in terms of pessimism of the intellect, are policymakers dreaming anything other than public-private partnerships? Hell no. It's a scandal. And I think that's also, I mean, the reason I wanted to end with this, though, is to suggest that, again, when it comes to policy imagination, the imagination of policymakers is impoverished. And it's impoverished in part because of us, because our politics are not letting us be as militant and as radical as we should be. We should be dreaming far more radically than we are at the moment, myself included. I mean, I think that the way that politics is set up in the United States, where you have the Republicans and the Democrats, and the best you can get is a kind of Kucinich-style kind of Democrat, and he's going to bear the weight on his tiny little shoulders of the hopes of a generation. It seems to me very, very sad, because in fact the history of American politics is of much more radical thought. I mean, we're going to the Hull House later on this evening. There's a place where radical thought flourished, and the reason that we have things like the 19th Amendment to the Constitution is because of the radical activism of women like, Jane Addams, and that kind of thinking belongs back in America, and I think that's one of the reasons why you'd be right to be a pessimist of the intellect. Oh, is a pessimist? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a way of agreeing with you. Thank you. Hello.
Okay. Hi. So it's pretty clear that grassroots movements are definitely more effective in decreasing infant malnutrition and things like that. But do you think that there's a way to incentivize large corporations to work through those mediums more than like using business to raise people out of poverty?
Yeah, no. I mean, I can see where you're coming from, because it seems like, well, look, what if Coke just sponsored some of this, right? I mean, what if they gave money for the seed program and then moved away? And That's not what Coke wants to do. I mean, I think that the structures that the New Alliance has set up are structures that involve the expertise residing in Coke. And there's a kind of epistemic problem here of who is it that gets to know about the world and who is it that gets to be enacting change in the world. And of course, Coke would push back and say, no, we have these entrepreneurs, these women entrepreneur units. Have you seen these things that are, they're sort of solar-powered, charging water filtration, so cell phone charging, water filtration, Coke-selling units, like machines. They're I don't know, they're like, I don't know, like a block. And the idea is that it becomes a space where women can run a small business and empower themselves and sell Coke. And you can see them around the world, particularly in India, but they're spreading widely because what Coke wants to do is provide this kind of individual entrepreneurial space where women can go out and do this, and this is their way of empowering women. And what that does absolutely is not challenge patriarchy. It doesn't provide the mechanisms for community activism. It doesn't really provide the mechanism or space for people to dream ideas that don't involve Coke. I mean, you could imagine, well, as a gesture of goodwill, they would do this on the side. But what the idea of Recipe Days is about radical social transformation nationwide. And it is spreading, these ideas are spreading down from northern Malawi down to southern Malawi, marching very slowly, but all the while not compatible with the kind of epistemology of the New Alliance. So, I mean, I can see why one would want to be able to say, well, big corporation, why don't you do this? Because this is a much better thing to do than just, adding nutrients to Coke. I mean, did you remember Diet Coke Plus? Those of you who don't remember, Diet Coke Plus was was Coke's response to the criticism that it was in the business of selling stuff that was basically bad for you by having Diet Coke and then an assortment of vitamins and nutrients so that you could drink your chemistry set, basically, and feel better at the end of it. And that was their response. I mean, they were like, this is what we're doing. Like, you said we're not nutritious. Here we are, nutritious. And of course, that's nutritionism at work, right? That's exactly the kind of logic of nutritionism, where you reduce thinking about the way we eat to, well, Coke's going to add vitamins to the fucking stuff. What do you want? Blood? So I think that asking the private sector to respond to a question like patriarchy is just, it seems to me, asking them to do things they're not equipped to do. I don't want my anti-patriarchal activity branded by Coke. I think that would be unfortunate and also impossible. And instead, it seems to me that what corporations ought to be doing is getting out of the way, and they won't do that willingly. But the way that we have to regulate private enterprises have been gradually eroded, particularly in this country. But again, what gives me some measure of hope is that there are countries where these enterprises are being pushed back and they're being corralled so that people can have the space to dream these bigger thoughts, and that is reassuring. But can I ask you, why do you want the private sector to do this?
I was just wondering if it was possible. If you thought it could ever happen.
But if it were possible, why would that? Would it be a good thing?
I think it would be better than the alternative of them.
Of them not doing it.
Not doing anything or actively being unhelpful.
I guess I think that there are some things that, just because these organizations are powerful and can do things, I'm not sure that we should allow them to. I think that there's also an element of responsibility that we as citizens have gotten unused to rather. The idea of being part of a community and being engaged in politics and being responsible for the way that we dream our political lives is something that has been taken away from us. And I am very reluctant to cede that back to another agency, even if they're powerful enough to make it happen, because that diminishes my capacity to be able to control it. And I think that's a trajectory that we've been on for a long time. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for staying to me. Really appreciate it.